Welcome to Relax Story, a place where gentle stories help you leave behind the noise of the day and slowly drift into a peaceful sleep. Each soft, soothing narration is designed to relax your mind, release tension, and guide you to a deeper sense of calm within. If you enjoy the experience, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay with Relax Story every night, and feel free to leave a comment to share your thoughts or suggest a story you'd love to hear. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let Relax Story guide you into a restful deep sleep. Present-day Paris opens like a plane of light, where illumination stretches along classical boulevards, where more than 2 million people inhabit the inner city, moving each day across squares, across bridges, past buildings that have endured for centuries, forming an unbroken rhythm, a current of light, sound, and motion that few cities can rival, a place where art, history, and modern life interweave like layers of paint upon a canvas never truly finished. Everything unfolding above ground carries the sense of life, of constant presence, of a city that never truly sleeps, where every street holds its own story, every corner preserves the trace of footsteps long gone. And yet, beneath that luminous surface, at a depth of nearly 20 meters, another world exists entirely apart, without light, without motion, without the sounds of life, only corridors stretching through darkness, where time seems to have come to rest long ago, where a system known as the Paris Catacombs extends like a vast underground network, linking hundreds of kilometers of tunnels that were once ancient quarries, now transformed into a resting place for more than 6 million human skeletons, gathered over centuries, silent, enduring, stripped of names, stripped of identity, leaving only the most elemental form of human existence. The number 6 million ceases to be abstract when set beside the scale of a modern small city, where each individual once lived a singular life, held memories, experienced moments that could never return, now gathered into a space whose length may exceed 300 kilometers, though only a small fraction is open to the world above. Every step upon the surface therefore carries an unseen layering, where beneath, within the same space, dozens, even hundreds of lives may once have existed, breathed, and endured within the same city, though in different moments, in different centuries, a city above, another city below, far more silent, far more dense. The catacombs are not a cemetery in the familiar sense, not a place where each individual is laid to rest in a marked and separate position, but an urban ossuary established in the late 18th century when the authorities of Paris faced a crisis that could no longer be delayed. The overwhelming congestion of inner-city cemeteries, where centuries of continuous burial had rendered the space uncontrollable. What lies beneath the earth is not the randomness of death, but the result of an organized decision, a solution designed to contain, arrange, and sustain a mass of remains far beyond what any space above ground could hold. Along the long and narrow corridors, bones are arranged in layers, in structures, where skulls and long bones at the front form walls of distinct shape, almost bearing a sense of design, while behind them lie denser accumulations, stacked in a manner only a system of order could maintain. Each segment of corridor becomes a unit of storage, each layer of bone a component of a larger structure, where death is no longer an isolated end, but becomes material for an architecture shaped by human intent. a structure not meant for the living, yet entirely created by the decisions of the living. The question emerges, not as simple curiosity, but as an opening of awareness. Why would a city require such a space? One capable of holding millions of skeletons, hidden entirely beneath the surface of present life. To answer, one must return centuries earlier, to a time when burials took place within the city itself, when cemeteries were not only places of rest but part of daily life, where land was used continuously, without pause, without renewal, only the steady accumulation of human remains growing ever denser. The Cemetery of Saints' Innocents, among the oldest of them, had operated for centuries, receiving countless bodies without the capacity to expand, until the soil itself ceased to be soil, becoming instead a mass of mixed matter, where the boundary between the living and the dead blurred, not in philosophy, but in physical reality. Odour, gas, and decay escaped control, spreading into the surrounding environment, creating pressure not only of space but of public health. When the signs of excess could no longer be ignored, the city was forced to confront a choice. The space above had been exhausted. The answer could not be found there, and so the solution emerged from a place no one had once imagined as a domain of death, the voids left by former quarries, places that had once provided the material to build the city above, now becoming the place to receive what the city could no longer hold upon its surface, a quiet but complete inversion, where the material that once shaped the architecture of life now holds the remains of lives long ended. If one were to stand upon a street in Paris in the evening, when the lights stretch into the distance and the city begins to quiet, when footsteps grow sparse and the rhythm of the city lowers itself, there may come a moment when everything seems to pause, not in reality, but in perception, a moment when the thought of depth begins to take form. Beneath, at nearly 20 meters below, there is no empty void, no undefined earth, but a dense space of former presence, where millions who once had names, stories, and a place in the flow above, now remain only as structures of bone, stacked in absolute silence. No memory remains, no individuality endures, only the most fundamental form of the human body persists. The stillness of this place is not emptiness, but accumulation, where each layer of bone represents a moment in history, each mass the result of a chain of events extending across centuries, where death does not vanish from the city, but is transformed, organized, placed into a structure that exists alongside the life above, a city of the living, a city of what remains after life, two spaces occupying the same geography, yet entirely separate in experience. The catacombs are therefore not the beginning of this story, but the outcome of a long chain of processes, from the extraction of limestone for construction, to the relentless expansion of the city, to the crisis of burial space, and finally to an administrative decision whose consequences have endured for centuries. Each element in that chain was necessary, each step leading to the next, like a sequence of reactions whose final result lies deep beneath the ground. To understand this structure in full, one must leave the present behind, move against the flow of time, return to a moment when these tunnels bore no relation to death, when they were simply voids carved for the purpose of building another city, a city rising above, unaware that those empty spaces would one day become the physical memory of millions of lives. Before it became a city of bones, It was nothing more than emptiness carved to build a city above. From around the 13th century, as Paris entered a period of increasingly visible population growth, the shape of the city began to change in a rhythm deeper and more enduring than the eye could easily perceive. More houses were needed, walls had to be strengthened, churches expanded, public works raised to match a city growing within medieval Europe. Every stone laid upon the surface marked development, yet also signalled another quieter process unfolding below. The material behind much of that beauty was Lutetian limestone, a sedimentary stone common to the Île-de-France region, formed from a far older world, when this land lay beneath shallow seas millions of years ago. It was not so hard as granite, nor so fragile as to be useless. It rested in a near-perfect balance, soft enough to quarry, stable enough to shape, strong enough to support vaults, walls, towers, and palaces. Paris, in a deeply material sense, built itself from the body beneath its own feet. What mattered was not only the nature of the stone, but its location. It did not lie in distant regions requiring weeks of transport by cart or river. It was there, directly beneath the ground upon which the city rose day by day. That proximity shaped an entire logic of urban growth. As the need for construction increased, Paris did not merely rise higher above ground, it carved deeper below. At first, extraction took place in open quarries at the outskirts, where layers near the surface could be removed with relative ease. But the city did not remain still. It expanded outward, slowly yet relentlessly, like fabric being stretched wider. Areas once at the edge became part of the city itself. Quarries once distant would come to lie beneath streets, houses, churches, and marketplaces. From there, the method of extraction changed. Miners no longer worked only at the surface, but dug downward, opening passages, carving corridors, creating wider chambers to reach valuable layers of limestone. Each strike of the tool opened a small void, each void connecting to another, extending year after year, century after century. There was no single master plan laid out from the beginning. No central hand directing the labyrinth from its birth. It grew like roots beneath the earth, guided by need, by opportunity, by the position of the stone, by the decisions of different groups of workers across different periods. Above, a city built of stone. Below, another city formed by the absence of it. The geology of Paris had prepared this long before Paris itself existed. Beneath the city lay a thick layer of limestone formed in ancient marine environments, where sediment accumulated slowly across spans of time, almost beyond imagination. A sea became stone. A seabed became cathedral walls. Layers of ancient marine life compressed through time, becoming the material for structures of power, faith, and urban life. The scale evokes something overwhelming. The medieval city appears to be the product of a few centuries of human labour, yet the material sustaining it is the result of tens of millions of years of silent geological change. Paris rose far more quickly than the time required to create the stone that sustains it. It is the difference between human time and the time of the earth. Across centuries of extraction, the ground beneath Paris gradually took on the form of a complex network. Corridors stretching like endless veins, chambers where stone had been cut into blocks, pillars left behind to support ceilings from collapse. The space was uneven, asymmetrical, not shaped by aesthetic intent, yet carried a strange order born of repeated labour over time. Stone pillars standing in emptiness like frozen memories of extraction, rough walls bearing marks of tools, of human effort, of techniques from different eras. Seen as a whole, what stands out is not only the immense scale, extending for hundreds of kilometres across the wider network, but the manner of its creation. It did not appear as a single project begun and completed. It accumulated, it expanded, it spread. It was shaped by generations who never fully knew the magnitude of the structure they were helping to create. By the 16th and 17th centuries, another movement began to emerge. Paris continued to swell, its population growing, its districts overlapping areas that had once been the city's edge. Quarries that had once been separate now lay beneath increasingly dense neighbourhoods. At the same time, methods of extraction and transport evolved. New sources of stone farther from the centre became more viable as transport improved and urban economic organisation grew more complex, as materials could be brought from elsewhere at acceptable cost. Many inner-city quarries gradually lost their original role. Extraction ceased in numerous places, work withdrew, people left. The voids remained, without comprehensive reinforcement, without centralised oversight equal to their true scale. Beneath Paris, the ground was no longer merely natural foundation. It had become a vast hollow network, abandoned in places, insufficiently monitored, not managed as a unified whole. Above, the city continued its life. New buildings rose, streets grew crowded. The weight of the city increased with each wall, each roof, each structure added. Above grew heavier, below grew more fragile. On the surface there was motion, commerce, faith, power. Beneath, silence, pillars bearing unseen loads, voids existing beyond the awareness of most inhabitants. A paradox formed, so slowly that no one could feel it in any single day, yet so clearly that history could not ignore it. Paris was being built upon the very emptiness it had created. That paradox carried particular weight because it was not an accident imposed by nature. It was the result of success. The more the city developed, the more that development accumulated upon a ground already hollowed beneath. The more it expanded, the more memory of old quarries faded. One generation built homes where another had extracted stone. One generation prayed in churches built of stone without seeing the tunnels from which it came. Another generation was born into a crowded Paris, unaware that beneath familiar streets lay an entire world of darkness stretching outward. Beneath their feet was not merely earth, it was history carved into emptiness. If even a single variable in that flow had changed, the entire story might have taken another course. If Paris had not quarried stone beneath itself, if building materials had been sourced from afar from the beginning, if the geological body beneath the city had not been hollowed into a network over centuries, then that vast emptiness would not exist. There would be no forgotten corridors beneath the streets, no chambers gathering silently in darkness, no ready-made space awaiting a new purpose when crisis would come. Without that silent foundation, Paris might still be a city of cathedrals, palaces, squares, and cemeteries, but it would likely never have had catacombs as the world knows them. Sometimes a great symbol of history does not begin with the will to create it, but with something entirely practical, almost mundane, like quarrying stone to build walls. It is here that the perception of Paris begins to change. The city is not only what appears in the light, not only pale stone facades, towers rising into the sky, paved streets and crowded squares. It is a two-layered structure, almost two worlds occupying the same space. Above, life, rhythm, bells, the authority of humanity upon the surface. Below, the void created by that same humanity, not yet bearing its final name, not yet given a new purpose, not yet redefined, yet already there, enduring, silent, waiting for a moment when history would unexpectedly require it. At this point, those tunnels remained only the negative space of a growing city, and yet that negative space would shape one of the deepest identities of Paris in centuries to come. By the late 17th century, the picture had largely formed. Beneath Paris lay an extensive network of mines, much of it no longer in use, many sections without centralized control, many areas existing as forgotten voids beneath increasingly heavy architecture above. The ground in many places had grown less stable than the surface suggested. Given enough pressure, enough time, a single weakness pushed to its limit, all that silence could give way to collapse. The emptiness below was no longer merely the trace of past extraction. It was becoming something else. A risk. And as the 18th century approached, the city would be forced to look beneath its own feet and understand that what lay in the darkness did not belong only to the past. It was waiting to be named by a new kind of fear. By the mid-18th century, Paris had drifted far from the city it had once been in centuries past. The streets were more crowded, the blocks more tightly packed, and the weight of commerce, daily life, and movement pressed ever heavier upon a ground so familiar that no one thought to question it anymore. Above stood a city expanding to the rhythm of power, population, and ambition. Beneath, in a silence that had endured across generations, lay another world, far older, shaped from layers of limestone once carved away without end to build the very city above. In the district of Rue d'Enfer, the land that would later be associated with d'Enfer Rochereau in southern historic Paris. These two realities began to draw toward collision. The tunnels below had never been dug with the intention of destroying the city above. They were simply the remnants of a building economy that had stretched back to the Middle Ages. Yet as the streets grew denser, as weight accumulated year by year, life by life, wall by wall, wheel by wheel, footstep by footstep, those old voids quietly prepared the conditions for a crisis that could no longer be ignored. By 1774, what had long remained in darkness no longer stayed there. In the area of Rue d'Enfer, a major collapse occurred, swallowing nearly 300 meters of ground. That number carried more than physical scale. It bore psychological weight. A small crack could be filled. A vague technical warning could be postponed, but a stretch of land of such length disappearing within the heart of a city could not be dismissed as a local incident. It was as though a city walking upon stone suddenly heard hollowness echo beneath its own feet. Stability, once assumed, became a question. The public road, once a symbol of order, certainty, and connection, revealed that it too could open like a wound. The void below was no longer an invisible inheritance of quarrying past. It had become a presence capable of striking back. The event was tied to an area resting upon an old quarry network, where stone chambers had existed longer than any structure standing above them. For that reason, the collapse of 1774 would later be seen as a symbolic turning point, the moment Paris was truly forced to act upon the underground world it had inherited but never fully governed. The fear did not lie merely in the sinkhole or the length of the land affected. It lay in what the event revealed. A road could vanish. The ground of a city could lose its support. A city could be threatened not by armies, not by fire, not by flood, but by the empty spaces carved by human hands centuries before. When 300 meters were swallowed, it was no longer a single flaw. It was a warning at the scale of an entire system. The cause of such instability lay in geology, in the history of extraction, in the accumulated weight of the city over time. Paris was built upon rich limestone layers, material that had once nourished the city's growth with its own mineral body. When the stone was taken away, what remained was not a solid foundation but voids, ceilings of tunnels, natural or artificial pillars, zones dependent upon structures that had aged with the passing years. A city may stand upon stone. A city may also stand, for a time, upon the memory of that stone. By the logic of geology and the history of Parisian quarries, collapse rarely arrives as a sudden explosion. It comes as a process, slow, very slow. Tunnel ceilings weaken, pillars lose their strength. The covering above grows thinner under prolonged weight. A small fracture meets a larger void. A larger void meets an aging structure. In the end, the surface above can no longer distribute its burden as it once did. Urban pressure is what made the danger visible. Every new house added another layer of load. Every heavily used road brought repeated compression. Each generation living above unknowingly placed more weight upon a hidden world beneath them. The danger did not reside in a single moment, but in accumulation so gradual it became almost invisible. Much like the human body can endure for years before sudden pain reveals a deeper illness, the ground beneath Paris bore the weight of a growing city until it could remain silent no longer. The city above expanded as though the ground were a certainty. The city below obeyed another truth. Stone has the limits of stone. Void has the laws of void. Time has the patience of time. At some point, all limits demand to be seen. After the severe collapses, royal authority could no longer treat the underground network as abandoned remnants of the past. Under Louis XVI, the response began to take the form of policy. On September 15, 1776, the king issued a decree permanently banning the extraction of materials beneath public roads. This was not merely a technical prohibition. It marked a shift in the state's perception. The old quarries were no longer a dim backdrop to construction history. They had become a present urban safety issue, directly tied to the stability of Paris above. When a government begins to regulate what lies beneath its streets, it means the city has accepted a new truth, that the order of life above depends upon control over what cannot be seen. That shift became even clearer on April 4, 1777, when Louis XVI established the General Inspectorate of Quarries to oversee the protection of Paris's mines. From that moment, the voids no longer lay outside the language of administration and engineering. They entered records, maps, reinforcement plans, systematic surveys. Engineers and inspectors took on a crucial role in the years that followed. They examined old quarry zones, identified danger areas, determined where reinforcement was needed, where monitoring was required, where threats to streets and structures above were immediate. More importantly, they created a new way of seeing. For the first time, Paris looked beneath its own feet not only with fear, but with measurement, classification, documentation, and organized intervention. Anxiety slowly transformed into management. Darkness began to give way to maps. And yet, even in that moment, a quiet assumption lingered above the city like a cloud without sound. If a stretch of street could be swallowed, what would happen if such failure spread further? If not just a road, but an entire row of houses, if not merely a public surface, but a populated district losing its support in a chain of collapses? In that case, Paris would not only lose infrastructure, it could lose something far more fundamental, the sense of safety that sustains a city's belief in itself. A city exists upon the assumption that the ground will still be there in the morning. Once that assumption fractures, every rhythm of life above changes. This was not an exaggeration of danger. It was a precise reflection of a rational fear. The fear that a city might not collapse from the outside, it might collapse from within, from its own voids, from what once served construction, then waited in silence to demand its price. The true climax of this moment did not lie in the sound of falling earth, but in a new awareness spreading through the mind of the city. Paris understood that its ground could no longer be assumed stable. A city built to rise upward, to expand outward, to display power through boulevards, squares, and facades, was forced to confront the truth that beneath that solidity lay a space empty, old, fragile, and capable of responding to the weight above. Paris did not only possess houses, avenues, and squares. It possessed an underground body, and that body had begun to show signs of crisis. Clear signs, unforgettable signs. The immediate result of the crisis was the formation of a state mechanism to monitor, survey, and protect the quarries beneath Paris. From then on, the underground network was no longer entirely ownerless. It entered records, it entered maps, it entered the city's strategy of protection as an essential part of the city itself. Yet while Paris learned to reinforce the voids beneath its feet, another pressure gathered above ground, no less silent, no less severe. Inner city cemeteries had become overloaded, especially those that had served for centuries and could no longer contain more. Thus the great paradox of Paris emerged. The city had just discovered the threat of its forgotten tunnels. Soon after, those very tunnels would be given an entirely new purpose, no longer tied to stone, but to the most tangible memory of death. As Paris learned to reinforce the voids below, it was also forced to face another burden, not held in stone, but in the memory of the dead above. Before the late 18th century, Paris had not yet learned to place the living on one side and the dead on another. For centuries, the city grew with the sound of church bells, with crowded markets, with narrow streets, and also with cemeteries woven into the very rhythm of daily life. Burial did not take place at the distant edge of the city, as it would later. It took place beside church walls, near where people passed, near where goods were traded, near neighbourhoods where hearths still burned and shops opened each morning. Death was not pushed beyond the city, it remained within it, quiet, familiar, so close that generations accepted it as a natural order of life in medieval and early modern Paris. A city that breathed, buried and continued to live upon the material memory of its dead. The place where the limits of that order appeared most clearly was the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents, near Les Halles, a central district long among the busiest in Paris. This was the city's largest and oldest cemetery, used almost continuously for nearly 1,000 years before its closure in 1780. By then, it was no longer merely a location on the urban map. It had become a heavy symbol, as though the entire burial past of Paris had been compressed into a space growing ever tighter, ever fuller, ever closer to its final limit. In truth, for a long time, it had ceased to be a cemetery in the simplest sense. Burial space there did not consist solely of individual graves lying quietly beneath the ground, but also mass graves and structures for storing bones, signs that the intake of the dead had far exceeded the bounds of a typical parish cemetery. Each new layer of earth did not erase the old. Each new burial did not truly create new space. It simply added another layer to a history of decomposition already in place. Paris grew across the centuries. The population increased. Epidemics passed. Harsh winters passed. Waves of death passed. And the city continued to compress the end of human life into a space growing more suffocating with time. The longer it endured, the more abnormal that normality became. Those most directly affected were not abstract figures in administrative records, but residents living around the cemetery, merchants near the market, families who continued to bury their dead according to custom, clergy bound to the old order, and eventually city officials and the crown, who began to understand that this was no longer merely a matter of faith or habit. When a burial ground lies too close to homes, too close to commerce, too close to the living heart of a city, any change within it inevitably becomes an issue for the entire urban body. Death no longer remained behind cemetery walls. It began to exert pressure on air, on soil, on health, on perception across Paris. This overcrowding was not a sudden crisis appearing in a few final years. It had grown slowly, almost in rhythm with the city's own history. A cemetery operating for nearly 1,000 years at the heart of an ever more crowded Paris had a conclusion nearly written from the beginning. At some point, the number of the dead accumulated there exceeded what the ground could contain, what the environment could absorb, what a city striving to maintain normal life above could endure. The Cemetery of the Holy Innocents became a vessel filled too far, not shattered at once, but stretched to its limit. The most frightening aspect was not the smell alone, nor the imagination of corpses, but the fact that the crisis had become a material urban problem. Mass graves, prolonged decomposition, proximity to homes and to a major market meant that the cemetery was no longer a separate realm for the dead. It had become part of the very air Paris breathed, part of the ground Paris walked upon, part of the rhythm of life the city still tried to call normal. This was not a distant fear. It was a boundary of sanitation already crossed at the centre of the city. There was no distance left. Then came the spring of 1780, and what had gathered silently for centuries finally emerged as an undeniable incident. After a period of heavy rain, a wall beside the cemetery collapsed, allowing burial matter to spill into the basement of a neighbouring structure. The meaning of this detail went far beyond the image of a construction accident. It marked the moment when a crisis long contained behind cemetery walls broke directly into civil life, forcing the city to face what it had delayed for too long. all debate lost its abstraction. When the boundary between burial and habitation was breached so concretely, the old system could no longer be defended by tradition alone. After that event, the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents was closed to new burials in 1780. This decision did not merely end the fate of a single cemetery, it began a deeper transformation in the governance of Paris, as burial within inner-city cemeteries was gradually prohibited and the old order deemed beyond saving. The city had crossed a threshold where delay no longer meant stability. To preserve the status quo now meant only to deepen the crisis. At that moment, a larger truth emerged. Late 18th century Paris was under two pressures at once, one beneath its feet and one upon its surface. Below were the voids left by centuries of limestone extraction, threatening collapse across an expanding city. Above were the overcrowded cemeteries, no longer capable of receiving more dead without driving the city into sanitary and spatial crisis. The catacombs should therefore not be seen as a strange idea born of darkness, nor as an invention of curiosity. They were an answer to two fractures at once, one in the ground, one in the burial order. When the ground could no longer be trusted and the cemeteries could no longer contain, the city was forced to imagine an entirely different model. Within this turning point, each force held its role. The residents were the most immediate pressure, breathing that air, living upon that ground, bearing those environmental consequences. The church belonged to the old order, so any change involving remains and burial required delicate negotiation. City officials and the crown alone could transform social awareness into administrative action at the scale of the entire city. Thus, the underground resting place did not first emerge as a symbol of death. It emerged as a decision of governance at a moment when Paris could no longer prolong the old condition. The first transfers of remains from the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents began between 1785 and 1787, and the ossuary was consecrated on April 7, 1786, marking the moment the new solution entered the city's history. Perhaps it is enough to imagine a Parisian family in 1780 to grasp the quiet depth of this turning point. A loved one has just passed. The church bells still ring. The streets remain crowded. The market continues. The city, on the surface, moves as it always has. And yet, in seeking a place for burial, that family must have felt something profoundly different from generations before. The cemetery no longer appeared as a firm and sacred conclusion within the order of life, but as a space nearly filled, a ground straining to contain what it could no longer hold. No dramatization is needed. To stand close to that moment is enough to see the truth. Cold and still, the city was running out of space for death. A city that grows dense, old, layered with memory, finds it ever harder to place the final part of human life. Paris had become a body carrying too many traces of its past, until its own material memory turned into a burden. The climax of this story lies not in horror, but in a deeper, quieter realization. Paris stood not only above voids beneath the earth, but surrounded by burial spaces that could no longer receive the dead. Above and below, the city had reached its limits. Only a decision remained. From that point, Parisian thinking began to shift, from preservation to displacement, from prolonging an old model to creating one without precedent at such scale. Human remains would no longer be compressed within exhausted inner-city cemeteries, but moved into an entirely different space, an underground world once seen as useless dangerous and forgotten beneath the city's feet. That choice transformed the fate of abandoned tunnels, and with it, the historical meaning of Paris's underground itself. Paris did not solve its burden by opening another cemetery above ground. It solved it by sending the dead into a world that had long existed in silence, as though centuries of quarrying had left behind a vast vessel waiting to be filled. After 1780, Paris had reached a threshold it could no longer postpone. The closure of the Saints' Innocent Cemetery did not merely seal off a burial ground worn to its final limit by time, population density, and sanitary crisis. It opened a far heavier question, the question of where to place the remains that had gathered for nearly 1,000 years at the heart of the city. At that very moment, beneath its feet, Paris already held a vast emptiness, silent and chillingly suitable. The Tombesoir quarries beneath the plains of Montrouge, then still at the edge of the capital. Tunnels once carved to raise the city now received another purpose, as though after centuries of lifting itself from the earth, Paris had begun at last to return its own memory to the darkness below. What followed bore neither the shape of a public rite nor that of a funeral procession in any familiar religious sense. It was an urban operation, deliberate, prepared, administered through a machinery both technical and precise. The preparation of the site and the orchestration of the transfers fell to Charles-Axel Guillaumeau, inspector within the office established in 1777 to oversee and reinforce the quarry system after the collapses that had shaken the city. That detail alters the beginning entirely. At the centre stands not only the dead, but the living, carefully arranging a silent migration of urban memory, where technique, authority, and death meet within the same space. The first removals took place between 1785 and 1787, beginning with Saints' Innocents, the largest cemetery in Paris. The Catacombs did not begin, as modern imagination might gather, with millions of skeletons unified at once into a single vision. They began with a phase defined by time, place, process, and intent. Such precision draws the underground into view not as a finished myth, but as a quiet site of history, where each night a city dismantled its greatest cemetery and lowered it into another world. These transfers unfolded at night. Darkness here was not merely setting, but choice, political and social. To move the dead under cover of night was to avoid the hostility of the people and the resistance of the church, for to disturb the dead is never a matter of transport alone. It touches family memory, religious habit, the belief that rest must remain undisturbed within its sacred order. Paris understood this well. It refused spectacle. It chose night as a curtain thick enough to soften reaction, to conceal symbolic disruption, to allow the work to repeat steadily, night after night. The route began at Saints' Innocents, where graves, communal pits, and ossuaries were opened to gather what remained of generations. It ended in the abandoned quarries of Tombesoir beneath Montrouge, within a vast network of tunnels stretching beneath Paris and its surroundings. Between these points moved an unseen procession of roles. City authorities decided, selected, directed. Guillaumeau stood at the technical centre, turning empty quarry into a space capable of receiving immense weight without disturbing the order above. The workers were the hands of history, silent below ground, receiving bones through shafts, distributing, stacking, arranging within the dark. The people of Paris lingered at the edge, present yet unawakened, a public deliberately left undisturbed. At the deepest centre remained the unnamed dead, stripped of identity, yet forming the very substance of the catacombs. Once each role had found its place, the operation revealed itself not as grandeur but as repetition. The opening of burial grounds, layer by layer, chamber by chamber, the gathering of what had once lain still beneath earth and stone, the slow turning of wheels in darkness, journeys outward and back again, while the city above slept or maintained its ordinary face, unaware that beneath its order it was quietly moving its dead. At Tombeau, the bones were not yet arranged into the walls known today. They were first poured into 2 shafts, then received below, distributed and heaped within the tunnels. This detail restores the catacombs to their origin, not a monument, not yet a symbol, but a place of reception, a solution shaped by administration and necessity. It was not art, it was response. Rarely in European history does a city dismantle a vast cemetery at its centre and transfer its remains into a redefined underground network. The act exceeds ritual. It belongs to public health, spatial governance, technical capacity, the burden of a past made material. That it was done at night reveals the sensitivity understood by those in power. They did not simply move bones, they touched the deepest layer of collective memory. Darkness became instrument. It softened, concealed, allowed the machinery to continue in near silence. Night, from that moment, ceased to be time alone. It became substance. It veiled the movement. It blurred the boundary between labour and right. It drew each journey into a rhythm, steady, almost hypnotic, like distant wheels over stone, like footsteps fading into corridors without end. No spectacle, no deliberate horror, only repetition, quiet, enduring, until an administrative act began to resemble a strange urban ritual. And at the heart of it all lay a quiet paradox. Each skeleton had once been a life. Each skull had once borne a name, belonged to a home, a street, a meal, a season, a morning somewhere above. Yet within the forming structure below, identity dissolved into mass. What remained was not biography, but shared silence, a city lowering its memory into darkness, where names fade, but traces endure. One may imagine, gently, that within each night cart lay hundreds of vanished voices, that each open grave revealed lives layered upon lives, once moving through streets, praying, trading, loving, falling ill, dying without knowing they would one day pass again through the city in darkness. Paris then held 2 cities in a single night, one of streets and bells, one of the dead, moving silently from visible memory into the unseen, not to mystify, but to reveal a shift from individual to collective, from burial ground to shared chamber, from name to structure. Its climax lies in that quiet contrast. In form, it was logistics. In duration, it became one of the strangest rites Paris had known. No great ceremony, no immediate monument, only bone, cart, darkness, repetition. A city patiently arranging its own death. What remained was bone. What remained was silence. What remained was the sense of a past lowered deeper, not erased, but reordered. In practical terms, the transfers of 1785 to 1787 eased the first burden of the cemetery crisis, removing remains from the city's largest burial ground. Yet beneath that result, something else emerged. Not a cemetery, not yet a monument, not a place of visitation, but a vast chamber of memory, unfinished, waiting to be shaped, arranged, and understood. When the final night carts of that first phase fell silent, what remained below had not yet taken the form the modern world would recognize. It was still bone, still darkness, still a depth heavy and unformed, where human order had only just begun to press itself upon silence. Above ground, early 19th century Paris remained a city of light, of boulevards, of stone rising toward the sky. Below, within the old voids of Tombissoir, another world slowly took shape, not luminous but cold, not moving but settled, holding within it the final material of countless lives. After the great transfers of the late 18th century, especially from Saints Innocents and other parish cemeteries, the underground first existed as solution. Bones were lowered, poured through shafts, heaped along corridors according to the urgency of sanitation and the management of death. It was not yet a place to behold, not yet a space of clear form, only a receptacle where a burdened city placed what it could no longer keep above. The turning point emerged in the early 19th century, when the space began to be seen differently. In 1809, the ossuary opened to the public by appointment, a small detail that marked a profound shift. From 1810 to 1814, a large-scale reorganization under Héricard de Thury did more than arrange the surface. It gave form, and from form, meaning followed. What had been storage became intention, rhythm, order, depth, a place where the living could not pass without pause before their own limits. At the centre stood Louis-Étienne Héricard de Thury, Inspector General of Quarries, who shaped the catacombs into the form that endures today. His role was not mere tidying. He created a spatial language where bones no longer lay forgotten, but were placed within deliberate order, guiding every step taken below. Under his direction, bones were arranged both practically and symbolically. One could walk, one could see, one was led into reflection, not by spectacle, but by the calm regularity of form. Behind that solemn appearance lay the quiet labour of workers, moving, sorting, building walls of bone, filling the unseen mass behind them, creating visual rhythm along the paths. What had once been poured down in urgency was lifted, turned, placed again within another order. The city above had not yet descended in numbers, yet the work assumed that one day footsteps would pass. Eyes would read this space not as formless remains, but as structure. Before this reorganization, bones lay in crude heaps, reflecting the urgency of the first phase. Order was not the aim. Memory was not the aim. Form was not the aim. Then bones became walls. Outer surfaces followed pattern, while the mass behind filled space according to the logic of the quarry. Rows of femurs and tibias formed layers, skulls set in steady rhythm, while the rest lay hidden behind as foundation. Not randomness, a visual language made from human material. Along the corridors, these lines of bone resembled dry masonry, a primitive architecture without mortar or carved stone, except that each line, each rhythm, each edge was formed from the remains of lives once lived. Here the catacombs took on their singular nature. Structure and message became one. Bone was no longer aftermath. It became form, and form began to carry meaning. Yet the transformation extended beyond the walls. The entire path became a composed experience. Corridors, pauses, small constructions all belonged to a shared order of thought. The space could be seen, maintained, traversed through layers of meaning. Classical and Egyptian-inspired structures appeared along the route. Columns, altars, plaques, false tombs, turning passage into journey. Names evoked religion, antiquity, romance, gathering symbolic memory across cultures of death and passage. Depth extended further through cabinets in the spirit of cabinets of curiosities, one for mineralogy, another for pathology. The pathological space displayed specimens of bone disease and deformity, reflecting studies of the late 18th century, showing the catacombs as a place not only to see, but to learn. Along the corridors, inscriptions of religion and poetry appeared as points of reflection. They did not demand fear, they did not seek shock. They simply returned death to the gaze of the living as a truth that cannot be delayed. Thus the space moved beyond storage into a cultural memory, where organization allowed visitation and symbol allowed contemplation. A form of memento mori beneath the city, quieter, more enduring. The deepest shift lay not in structure, but in perception. Bones were no longer access to be managed. They became order, rhythm, form, to be read by the eye before understood by the mind. Above, Paris shone in stone and movement. Below, it lay in stillness, in skulls and long bones, a negative reflection of the city above, as though history itself had an inner face, built not from boulevards, but from the remains of those who once lived, died, and faded from the individual memory, yet remained within a greater order. From here, the tone of Memento Mori grew clear. This space did not demand terror, it required stillness. Every boulevard, every facade, every light above rests upon time, and here, time is no abstraction. It has been made material, it has been compressed into wall, into vault, into path. It has become visible. One might imagine that person standing long enough among these lines of bone, within silence, damp air and endless corridors, would begin to feel that the city above is but a brief moment upon the surface of something far longer, not because the place is haunted, not because it threatens, but because here, time has taken form in human matter. When bone becomes form, it allows history not only to be understood, but as to felt, slow, deep, wordless. The direct result was a catacombs that took on the form known today: structured ossuary, architectural points, deliberate arrangement, layers of philosophical and educational meaning. The deeper result was quieter. Paris had transformed a practical solution into a space of memory, both aesthetic and contemplative. No longer merely a place for the dead, it became a place where the living descend to read death as part of the order of the world. And yet within that ordered space, another truth remained, smaller, closer, more painful than any symbol. There was once a man who entered this labyrinth and did not return. Within walls shaped into form, a life had wandered beyond all structure, lost and taken entirely by the dark. The time of this story does not unfold along the steady line of history, but breaks into two distant anchors, like the ends of a tunnel swallowed by darkness. One begins in 1793, when Philibert Aspert descended into the underground system beneath Paris and vanished. The other ends in 1804, when his body was found after 11 years lying beneath the earth, a span that seems brief within the flow of a century, yet long enough for a man to be severed entirely from the rhythm of life above, long enough for memory to fade before truth could be confirmed, long enough for space itself to become the only witness to an event unseen, unrecorded in its exact moment. What remains is a silence stretched thin, like a layer of dust settling over the quarry galleries some 20 metres below ground, formed from old limestone mines connected to Val de Grace and extending southward into historic Paris around Rue d'Enfer. A network not born to guide, but to extract, not designed to orient, but to hollow out the earth. At that time, it had not yet taken the shape of a memorial space or a place of display, had not yet become a symbolic structure of death, but remained a dark, fragmented infrastructure, as tangled as the city's own history digging deeper beneath itself. Across the vast weight of history ever told about the city, about the crises of cemeteries, about the transfer of millions of bones underground, the focus suddenly narrows until its original scale nearly disappears. No longer millions of names dissolved into a collective, no longer immense urban systems functioning as a single body. Only one man remains, rising from the dark ground of history, a single name, a single occupation, a final trace lingering within the memory of the underground, as if all the depth of Paris now held room for only one solitary fate to fall and be kept in silence. Philibert Aspert is recorded as a gatekeeper at Val de Grace Hospital during the time of the French Revolution, a role without symbolism, without power or renown, merely an ordinary position at the edge of the social order. Some secondary accounts suggest a connection to quarry labour, yet what returns most clearly is the image of an ordinary man standing within the turbulence of history, not an explorer, not a figure of distinction. Nothing suggests he was prepared to face a terrain beyond all ordinary experience. It is this very ordinariness that keeps the story from becoming legend, turning instead into a quiet haunting, where the boundary between daily life and the underground dissolves without warning, without any great event to announce it. In 1793, as Paris trembled under political and social upheaval, Aspert entered the tunnels and never returned. There is no verified record of his purpose, no unified explanation, only scattered fragments of anecdote insufficient to form a conclusion. The event does not resemble a journey retold, but a point of descent forgotten by history, where a man crossed the boundary between light and darkness and disappeared from all observable time, leaving behind not a great incident, but an absence slowly covered by the life continuing above. His disappearance bore no noise, no crowd to witness it, no chaos spreading through the city. Only a single motion. One man went down and did not come back. Then time stretched on until even absence lost its urgency, dissolving into the rhythm above ground, where everything continued as though nothing had occurred. This prolonged silence shifts the story away from all collective events recorded in these underground spaces. There was no mass transfer, no urban decree, only an individual swallowed by the terrain, leaving no signal at the moment it happened. 11 years later, on April 30th, 1804, the body was found within the tunnels, deep inside the same structure that had once consumed his presence. Time was no longer measured by waiting, but by the erosion of memory itself. When the body returned to light, it was no longer a living form, but a physical testament to prolonged disappearance. It was recorded, then buried at the very place it was found, turning the fall of a life into a fixed point within a space without center. The memorial inscription preserves it as a closed span of time, lost in 1793, found 11 years later, laid to rest where the entire final journey had been held, a detail that transforms the underground from a place of containment into one of direct inscription of a human fate. What prevents the story from ending as merely a death underground lies in the way identity was recovered after more than a decade of separation. A set of hospital keys was found beside the remains, along with small details of clothing, buttons, objects of no great value, yet enough to restore a name once blurred by time, as if after 11 years of darkness, what remained to affirm a man's existence was not memory or form, but the traces of daily life once tied to his work. Identity, in this way, was not restored in fullness, but through the smallest fragments left behind in an environment that had erased nearly everything. His burial at the site of discovery creates a deep paradox within this space. Most of the bones brought here from centuries past dissolve into a common anonymity, stripped of individual markers within a collective experience. Yet a single man is fixed to the exact point of his disappearance, becoming a precise marker within a system formed by the erasure of identity, as though the space itself had chosen to preserve one exception, to reflect its own nature. The underground network of Paris, formed from centuries of limestone extraction, created layered corridors, asymmetrical turns, chambers linked without clear orientation, a structure not meant for free movement, but for material removal. In time, it became a labyrinth defined by the absence of center and the absence of stable markers. Even in modern descriptions, it remains a complex network beneath the city, where orientation depends entirely on spatial memory and light. Without them, the structure becomes an endless repetition, its branches indistinguishable. In such conditions, light is not merely a tool of sight, but the foundation of spatial awareness. When light disappears, direction is no longer a matter of finding a path, but the survival of space itself as a concept. Identical corridors erase the sense of progression. Distance loses meaning. Time detaches from movement, becoming only the extension of an undefined state. In such an environment, the ability to locate oneself is nearly erased without continuous reference. And it is this very quality that turns the tunnels into a space where a small error in perception may lead to a disappearance without clear end. If a light were to go out within that network, the first thing lost would not be the path, but the sense of one's position, then the boundary between near and far, and finally, the sense of time. Each step would no longer move toward a destination, but repeat itself in darkness. A few meters could stretch into a far longer journey, a few minutes into an immeasurable sequence. In that distortion, the underground ceases to be merely physical, becoming a state of perception detached from all familiar measures. Among the countless remains beneath Paris, only one name remains as a clear anchor in historical memory, not because of greater worth, not because of greater importance, but by the accident of leaving behind enough traces to be known, while millions dissolve into anonymity. A quiet paradox. One individual named within a space built upon the loss of names, as if the silence itself had preserved an exception just clear enough to endure. The underground thus becomes not only a place where what is lost is kept, but where a living person may vanish entirely from the structure of recognition above, where the boundary between presence and absence depends not on life or death, but on the ability to orient within darkness. From this emerges a deeper awareness of how fragile existence becomes when placed within a terrain beyond the limits of human perception. From this event, the entire system ceases to be merely geological or archival. It becomes a space capable of absorbing direction, time, and identity itself, a place where existence is not preserved by memory, but shaped by the physical structure of the earth, where each individual who enters may be held or erased without any witness from above. While one man remained in that darkness, the city above continued. It moved, it changed, it pressed its history further downward, layer upon layer, into the earth, as though two worlds existed in parallel, never touching, one in constant motion, the other in silent accumulation of buried memory and matter. After the first corridors beneath Paris had been used as an emergency solution to the cemetery crisis of Saints' Innocents between 1785 and 1787, the city did not stop, did not close, did not treat that movement as a single act of urban sanitation. It extended it, quietly, across decades. From 1787 until 1814, the ossuary system beneath Tombeau continued to receive new layers of remains from within Paris, wave after wave, steady, unbroken, as though the more the city above changed, the more the space below remained constant, repeating a single rhythm, the rhythm of returning what had ended into a shared space without origin. The year 1789 opened another layer of reality above ground. Paris no longer faced only a sanitary crisis, but entered a period of deep political transformation. Old institutions were dismantled, power restructured. Parishes and convents lost their roles as centres of urban life. Cemeteries within the city were closed or dissolved. And while these changes accelerated above, below ground another rhythm endured, untouched by the noise of reform or conflict. The bones continued to descend with near-perfect regularity, as though history above fractured into many directions, while below it simply received all without reply. During this period, the sources of transfer expanded beyond a single origin, spreading across the city, from Saint-Eustache to Saint-Nicolas-des-Champs to the Bernardin convent. Places once central to religious and communal life became points of departure for a reverse journey. What had been buried within familiar parish boundaries was removed from its structure and brought to a single convergence at Tombeau, a place where the ground itself became a vast receiver of the city's fragmented memory, where every path of death ultimately led into the same limestone labyrinth beneath Paris. This process could not endure without a stable system to sustain it. The Paris authorities continued to oversee the transfers as part of urban reorganization, and Charles-Axel Guillaumeau, inspector within the Quarry administration, became a crucial link in transforming the underground from latent chaos into a controlled structure. Here, extraction techniques, geological survey, and urban planning met at a single point. The limestone corridors, once mere remnants of the earth, became a system capable of receiving and arranging the memory of death. While above, the people of Paris lived through revolution, witnessing power shift, unaware of the full reordering taking place beneath their feet. Those who once belonged to parishes, neighbourhoods, and different eras of Paris were no longer recognised as separate individuals within space or community. They became a collective layer, gathered within the same limestone structure, where distinctions of status, belief, or time could no longer hold. All fragments of urban life compressed into a single expanding underground, turning the catacombs from a technical solution into a vessel containing the scattered memory of an entire city. After 1789, the flow of remains continued through 1814, no longer tied to a single event, but existing as a long process of urban restructuring. New sources emerged from various parish cemeteries, reflecting a large-scale transformation in burial space. From a symbolic beginning at Saints' Innocents, the system expanded into a network receiving from many origins. The underground was no longer a localized solution, but a city-wide accumulation of memory. As this unfolded, the catacombs expanded not only in size but in nature. Each transfer carried not just bones, but the memory structures of communities, neighborhoods, rhythms of life once lived above. When brought together, the boundaries once clear dissolved. No trace of the original divisions remained, only a sediment of humanity settling within a vast limestone structure, where history no longer existed as separate lines, but merged into a unified mass. In this shifting period, the catacombs moved beyond their initial function as a sanitary measure. They became a space that received not only remains, but the history of the city itself. Each transfer was like a layer of memory stripped from the surface and laid beneath the earth, carrying the traces of communities once embedded in the old social order. And when all converged, Paris was no longer reflected as separate districts, but as a single entity gathering its fragmented memory into one place below. Above ground, the dead had once been divided by parish, neighbourhood, religious community, by precise social boundaries, but below, within the ossuary, those boundaries dissolved. All differences compressed into the same geological structure. The city, without intention, transformed its fragmented history into a unified mass beneath the earth, unable to return to its former state. Within this long process, Charles-Axel Guillemot stands at the intersection of technique and history, not merely an inspector, but one who organised the reception space at Tombissoir, where geology, engineering, and urban design converged. The latent chaos of old quarries became a system capable of expansion without collapse. The transfers continued until 1814, sustained not by a single decision, but by an entire technical framework holding the underground stable amid constant upheaval above. If these corridors could remember, they would not record individual events, but reflect a long process of change. Parishes vanished, cemeteries dissolved, social structures reshaped. All of it settled into layers of matter in the dark, as though the space itself recorded the transformation of the city not in words, but in the silent accumulation of what had been forgotten. In that silence, the catacombs ceased to be a mere technical structure. They became a witness without voice to the restructuring of Paris during its deepest fracture between the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Above, the constant movement of power and institutions. Below, the unending movement of what had ended. A long contrast between the light of political history and the darkness of human history. Seen as a whole, the catacombs are no longer understood as a solution to a cemetery crisis, but as an urban memory archive formed across decades. Layers of remains from many origins converge into a single structure, dense enough to preserve not only matter, but the traces of social change. A space ready to move beyond burial into being observed by the living above, when, at some point, the darkness below ceased to be only a place of reception and began to be looked into, explored, understood as part of Paris itself. And at last, when these corridors had gathered enough bones, enough centuries, enough fragments of Paris, the living were invited to descend, to look upon what the city had hidden from the light. After the limestone quarries at Ossuary were consecrated on April 7th, 1786, the underground space of Paris entered a new state of existence, where corridors once meant solely for the extraction of raw material became a mechanism for receiving the memory of the entire city, designated as a Paris municipal ossuary, a public structure operating as a site for the accumulation of remains from inner-city cemeteries, slowly reaching saturation, extending across the following decades as continuous transfers of bones poured in, gathering into a mass far beyond the original intent of a temporary solution, transforming this space into an urban entity of a permanence greater than any administrative projection had foreseen, where the residue of death no longer remained scattered, but condensed into a vast stratum of memory lying beneath the expanding rhythm of life above. As the 19th century began to form its first movements, Paris stood before a quiet paradox, where above was population growth, urban expansion, the ceaseless motion of boulevards and squares, while below lay an ever-deepening archive of human traces no longer part of the living world, forming an invisible yet persistent foundation beneath the entire structure of the city. And it was at this intersection that the perception of the ossuary began to shift, from a technical solution of sanitation into a space of memory, where the presence of death was no longer merely contained, but began to be understood as a form of urban historical record, opening the possibility of transformation into a place of remembrance, education, and observation. The year 1809 marked a pivotal shift, when the ossuary was formally opened to the public by appointment, a decision that turned a space governed by technical and administrative logic into one capable of receiving the gaze of the living, where each descent was no longer an entry into hidden infrastructure, but a guided rite, bounded, ordered, and meaningful from the first moment one reached the threshold leading underground. And in that moment, the catacombs began to depart from their purely functional state, moving toward a cultural existence where observation, memory, and interpretation became part of the structure itself. In that process of transformation, Louis-Étienne Héricard de Thury stood as the one who reorganized the entire language of the underground, in his role as Inspector General of Quarries, facing not only a system of limestone corridors and accumulated remains, but an entity without a defined form of presentation, where material disorder required conversion into something readable, and from a way of thinking described as both museographical and monumental, the ossuary was reshaped into a visual and cognitive path, where each wall of bone, each corridor, each point of pause held a role in shaping how one passed through and understood the presence of death within the city. Alongside this central figure was an urban administrative system operating in the background, where regulations of access, routes of movement, and forms of visitation were carefully structured, ensuring that opening the space did not result in chaotic intrusion, but became a controlled experience, a quiet staging of a city learning to face the deepest layer of its own history. While early 19th century visitors, both Parisians and those from beyond France, formed a new layer of observers, where the catacombs ceased to be a technical secret and became a destination of cultural curiosity, reflecting an early appeal that spread faster than the system itself had anticipated. The moment of opening by appointment was not merely an administrative act, but a redefinition of the relationship between space and human presence. When the municipal ossuary was acknowledged as a place one could enter to observe and contemplate, not with absolute freedom, but through a structured ritual where each descent carried the weight of a journey rather than a simple visit, creating a distinct layer of experience where the first encounter was not broken by disorder, but guided through a deliberate slowness, as if the city itself imposed limits to preserve the gravity of the memory resting beneath it. At the end of the initial route, a register was placed as a trace of experience, where the first reactions of visitors were recorded and quickly filled its pages, forming a rare phenomenon for a space born from technical necessity, where the urge to leave words behind became evidence of the profound impact of the place upon human perception, not through terror or shock, but through a lingering stillness, where what was written was not fear, but the realization of the absolute difference between this space and every structure above. The existence of those written lines revealed something beyond the initial data, that this space had begun to function as an experience capable of generating its own response, where people did not merely observe but felt compelled to answer, as though contact with the underground structure had awakened a new mode of perception, requiring acknowledgement that they had passed through a form of space beyond ordinary definitions of the city. Yet such an opening could not have taken place if the internal structure had remained in its original state of raw corridors and unordered accumulations of bone, for between 1810 and 1814 a deep process of restructuring unfolded as Héricard de Thury reorganized the entire space according to a new logic, where material no longer existed as random accumulation, but as a deliberately composed system, opening the possibility of reading space as a visual and spiritual language. Bones once scattered were arranged into structured wall surfaces, where femurs, tibias, and skulls formed repeating rhythms, creating architectural planes, while the remainder was pushed behind according to the logic of the old quarries, forming a dual structure between what was seen and what was concealed, between display and the technical foundation that continued to support the system above. Under this restructuring, the space was not merely cleaned or ordered, but composed as a material text, where architectural details, inscriptions, religious texts, poetry, and scientific displays coexisted along a deliberate path, creating an experience in which each pause held its own meaning, from classical and Egyptian-inspired motifs to named points such as Samaritan Fountain, Sepulchral Lamp, and Lacrimatory Sarcophagus, all forming a symbolic system where science and contemplation intersected within a single spatial structure. This transformation introduced a fundamental difference between a simple ossuary and a constructed cultural space. For while a structure that merely holds remains may end with storage, a space organised through display and education requires visual order, pauses of understanding, control of perception, and a structure that guides thought, so that each step becomes not only movement, but a gradual passage through layers of meaning, where death is no longer an unseen end, but a form that can be observed and interpreted. Once that form was established, the space below was no longer a place one entered merely to witness a repository, but an organised experience where the boundary between technique and culture began to dissolve, opening a new state of existence for the entire catacomb system. In the first steps of early 19th century Parisians, the descent did not carry terror, but a slowing of perception when confronted with a different order, where death appeared not as chaos, but as arrangement, with walls of bone, silent corridors, and a rhythm that compelled all movement to slow, as though the place itself adjusted so that what it sought to convey might be understood without words. Above lay a Paris expanding with boulevards, markets, churches, and a shifting public life, while below existed a structure of equal order built from the remains of those who had once lived within it, forming an unspoken contrast between two layers of existence, one of growth, one of preservation, yet both governed by the same principle of structure and time. If a Parisian of that century descended here for the first time, what remained was not awe at the quantity of bones, but the strange realization that even death could be ordered, that what had once been the chaos of endings had been transformed into a form that could be walked through, observed, and thought upon, as though the city had found a new language to speak of its deepest layer. In that moment, a subtle shift in perception occurred, as the municipal ossuary ceased to be understood as a technical response to urban crisis, and became a space where memory was organised, where death was no longer merely biological cessation, but part of a cultural structure operating beneath the living city above. From there, the catacombs entered the urban imagination as a space that could be spoken of, sought out, and retold, not only for its original function, but for its power to make one pause, observe, and reflect upon existence across centuries, where each descent was no longer a departure from the city, but an entry into a deeper layer of its history. From the moment in 1809 when the doors of the catacombs began to open under strictly controlled appointments, a space once existing solely as a technical response to Paris's cemetery crisis gradually entered another state of being, where the darkness beneath the ground no longer held only functional meaning, but began to reflect the imagination of the city above, where limestone corridors long silent became a convergence of gaze, memory, and urban curiosity. This shift did not occur as a sudden moment, nor as a declaration, but as a slow absorption, where each step downward reshaped the meaning of the space within collective awareness, from a purely administrative municipal ossuary into a cultural destination defined by the experience of those who passed through it, observed it, and retold it in their own way. In that movement, the catacombs did not change in physical form, but in how they were read, understood, and narrated in the language of 19th century Paris, where death was no longer pushed aside but placed within an observable order. This transformation was further fixed through a detail that seemed small yet carried symbolic weight. When a visitor register was placed at the end of the route, allowing each person to record their impression before leaving the underground space. The book filled quickly, not as procedure, but as a reflex of the mind, where experience extended beyond observation into the need to leave a trace, a confirmation that the descent had truly taken place. In the accumulation of those lines, the catacombs ceased to be a passive object of viewing and became a shared experience, retold through language, forming a second layer of memory not in stone or bone, but in human expression, where the space was reborn as a cultural entity capable of narrating itself. As the space entered the cultural life of the 19th century, movements at the highest levels of power began to echo beneath the ground, as figures of political and symbolic weight appeared within the catacombs. In 1787, the Count of Artois, later Charles X, descended with members of the royal court, marking an early moment when royalty touched a space born of technical necessity. In 1814, Francis I of Austria stepped into those corridors, extending the catacombs beyond national experience into the cultural and political networks of Europe. By 1860, Napoleon III and his son continued the path, as the presence of empire moved through a space once formed by urban administration. These events did not stand alone, but formed successive confirmations as the catacombs shifted from a domain of engineers and inspectors into a space sought by power, nobility, and diplomacy. Beneath this shift, the imprint of Ericard de Thury remained foundational, for his reorganization made it possible for the space to be read as a cultural monument rather than a mere repository. At the same time, visitors from different layers of society transformed it into a point of convergence, where experience was shared, discussed, and reshaped within social imagination. From its opening in 1809, the catacombs quickly moved beyond the scope of a technical structure to become a destination, sought not only by Parisians but by travellers across Europe. Records show this attraction was shared by both locals and foreigners, forming a rare urban phenomenon where an underground space became part of a mental map of travel, reflecting the complex relationship between modern city, death, and collective memory. In this logic, the catacombs were not a late invention of tourism, but an early expression of cultural curiosity, where people came not to consume images, but to face another order of existence. Visits by figures of power reinforced this phenomenon, as each presence became an act of confirmation. The curiosity of Charles X showed early entry into elite awareness. Francis I expanded its reach beyond France, and Napoleon III integrated it into the image of empire within a modern city. Through these confirmations, a common understanding emerged, where the space was no longer an architectural anomaly, but a legitimate part of the Parisian experience, where death was not hidden, but arranged to be seen and remembered. As cultural, political, and scientific layers moved around the catacombs, three parallel responses emerged, intersecting yet not dissolving into one another. At the cultural level, attraction arose from the meeting of darkness and the ordering of death, where rows of bones formed not just relics, but an architecture of memory. At the political level, the presence of power figures granted legitimacy, transforming it into a recognized part of the city's symbolic structure. At the administrative level, control remained constant, with opening regimes shifting, reflecting a space always governed, managed as a living heritage where order never separated from shadow. From this convergence, a fixed point emerged not in material, but in perception, where the catacombs became part of urban imagination, where memory, order, and death coexisted within an accepted structure. In that fixation, the underground space moved from periphery to centre in how Paris understood itself, as a city capable of organising even the end of the life within its structure. In a quiet imagining, if a distinguished visitor paused before the entries in the register, they might notice a recurring truth, that people from different walks of life carried the same unnamed state, neither fear nor knowledge, but a slow encounter with an ordered form of death, where nothing remained chaotic, but placed within a structure to be seen. In that repetition, the catacombs appeared as a rare space where death was no longer avoided, but observed in stillness, where one passed through not to escape, but to understand the city in both its light and its shadow. At the height of this process, the catacombs were no longer a repository of remains, but a space where 19th century Europe came to observe memory, order, and death within a single frame, where identity was fixed not by declaration, but by accumulated experience, visits, and retellings across time. In that fixation, the space no longer felt foreign, but became a legitimate part of urban life, where society had learned to accept darkness as part of its own structure. As the catacombs entered the symbolic life of Paris and Europe, they became not only a recognized destination, but part of a mental map where urban memory was preserved in material form. Yet those same corridors would continue to transform as the 20th century emerged, when darkness would no longer serve only remembrance, but become a space of strategy, resistance, and the silent movements of power in wartime, where tunnels once meant for memory would once again change their role in history. Paris. August 1944 revealed itself as a city stretched to its final limits, where the streets were no longer mere urban spaces but became a network of waiting, pressure, and unseen movement, as the long years of Nazi occupation entered their waning phase, and every pulse of the city began to waver between control and uprising, between stillness and eruption, between ordinary existence and the very moment in which history was taking shape in every corner of Paris. In that setting, the focus of the underground was no longer found in the long corridors of stone quarries or the ossuary structures bound to distant memory, but narrowed to a precise point beneath Denfert Rochereau, where a strategic shelter lay just below the surface, now associated with the Musée de la Libération de Paris at 4 Avenue du Colonel Henri Roltanguy, a depth of barely 20 metres, yet opening into a dimension entirely severed from the rhythm above. The darkness remained, the concealment remained, the separation from the city's light remained, yet its function had turned completely, no longer a place for preserving the past or the silence of death, but a centre of present action, where information, orders, and strategy took form under the cover of an urban surface in constant unrest. What stands out is that this very space, by historical record, had never been designed for military use, yet in the decisive days of August 1944, it became a strategic nerve point in the liberation of Paris, where the stillness beneath the ground no longer meant oblivion, but absolute concentration. At the core of that coordinating network stood Henri Roltanguy, one of the principal commanders of the French internal resistance, leading the FFY in Paris during the critical phase of the uprising, and from August 20th to August 28th, 1944, he and his command established their headquarters within the shelter beneath Denfert Rochereau, transforming what might have been a forgotten space into the control centre of a city on the threshold of historical change. The FFI, a coalition of French resistance groups, in this moment ceased to be merely symbolic and became a functioning system of action, where orders issued from the underground rose to the surface, directing the scattered movements of an uprising spreading through streets, districts, and every point of contact across the city. Opposing them stood the German occupying forces, the Wehrmacht, present as a structure of control over the surface. Yet in the final days of August 1944, that control began to fracture, creating gaps of power through which decisions made below ground gained decisive weight. Within this entire structure, the people of Paris existed as a continuous field of motion, at once witnesses and passive participants in the unfolding current, as each street became a point where news, waiting, and action converged, and history unfolded not only above, but was guided from beneath. Between August 20th and August 28th, 1944, the command post beneath Denfert Rochereau operated as a true coordinating centre of the Paris uprising, where orders were issued, transmitted, and transformed into action on the surface, forming a continuous chain of response between the underground space and the urban network above. Its importance lay not in its scale, but in its function, as a shelter never intended for war became a place of concentrated decision, where strategy formed in isolation and was then driven upward into the city, where FF1 forces carried out actions that would alter the course of liberation. Within this structure, the shelter ceased to be a passive refuge and became a centre of command, where collective will was condensed into the movement of a city shifting its historical state. Not a place of fighting beneath the earth, but a place from which the fighting above was directed. In a city as unstable as Paris in 1944, the underground carried clear strategic qualities, its concealment shielding command activity from direct observation, while separating it entirely from the chaos and disruption of the surface, where combat, information, and movement could break any structure of coordination. The confined, enclosed space, nearly devoid of the natural sounds of life above, created a unique condition for the concentration of information and decision-making, turning it into a true nerve centre of the resistance, where lines of communication could be maintained while the surface city shifted without rest. The reversal lay in the very nature of depth itself, for what had once been tied to memory, to ossuary structures, to the long silence of death, now became a space of coordination, where the vital decisions of a city were formed in darkness. The space did not change, only its function shifted with the rhythm of history. Within this system, the FFI acted as the link between depth and surface, for orders issued from the shelter held meaning only when received, translated, and executed in the streets, turning the entire city into a network of continuous response between command and action. In those days of August 1944, the Paris above existed in sustained tension, each street bearing the signs of a city nearing its breaking point, while beneath, in the command shelter under Denfert Rochereau, the rhythm followed a different structure, more compact, more minimal, yet more decisive. Above lay the fragmentation of urban life distorted by war. Below lay absolute concentration of decision, where information was gathered, processed, and turned into action through a short but powerful chain. This contrast formed a distinct image in urban history. where the underground was no longer merely the hidden layer of the city, but a place where part of history itself was generated, where action began not in light, but in darkness shaped with intent. Standing in the streets of Paris in August 1944, amid the scattered sounds of a city wavering between control and liberation, it would have been difficult to sense that beneath layers of stone and earth, only dozens of meters below, another space was operating with precision and focus. While the surface reflected the uncertainty of history, below, decisions were formed in isolation, where every movement held clear purpose, where each command was weighed in near total silence. The invisibility of this space was what granted it its unique role, for what mattered most did not unfold where it could be seen, but where it was entirely concealed from the awareness of daily life. In the historical structure of Paris, this moment marked a profound reversal, as a space once bound to the silence of death became a place sustaining the movement of life at a decisive hour, where decisions were not made in the streets, but formed in organized darkness. The shelter was no longer a symbol of concealment, but a symbol of coordination, where collective will condensed into action, where silence ceased to be emptiness and became the foundation for the movement of an entire city passing through a critical moment in history. After liberation, the space beneath Denfert Rochereau no longer held strategic function, yet its imprint remained, fixed as a layer of memory within the urban structure, as a temporary shelter became part of official history, recorded as a place that once sustained the coordination of a city at a decisive moment. Yet when the war ended, the underground network of Paris did not return to complete silence, but entered another form of existence, where unofficial explorers began to access, traverse, and extend their presence through corridors no longer belonging to military command or emergency authority. A new life began to take shape in the darkness, slow and discreet, separate from official history, yet existing alongside it. The war passed, but the labyrinth beneath Paris did not fall entirely silent. When orders ceased to echo in the dark, other footsteps came in their place, slower, more secretive, and entirely unofficial. The public section of the Paris Underground is only a narrow slice of the vast structure lying beneath the city, where the official route descends some 20 meters below ground and opens into a carefully controlled passage, winding through reinforced limestone chambers toward the ossuary that holds the remains of millions, a space that is at once historical and a display of collective memory. Yet this very limitation reveals a larger truth, that what is seen is only a fragment of an immense labyrinth, formed through centuries of extraction and reconstruction beneath the city. Geological records and urban surveys suggest that the network of quarries and tunnels beneath Paris stretches for nearly 300 kilometers, spreading like a second layer of space hidden beneath the modern city. While the portion open to the public is selected and contained, the remainder exists as a concealed structure beyond ordinary sight, where the divide between what may be seen and what is withheld creates a particular attraction within modern urban culture. This space is not only the remnant of past limestone extraction, but the trace of an uneven system of development, where each corridor and chamber was formed according to the needs of its time, without a unified design. From this, a second Paris emerged beneath the visible one, built not of light and architecture, but of accumulated darkness, void, and forgotten time. Since 1955, entry into quarry areas outside officially permitted zones has been considered illegal under urban management and public safety regulations in Paris. This moment marked a clear division between controlled space for visitation and the rest of the underground system placed under restricted access, where movement no longer belonged to personal curiosity but to law and preservation. Within that context, those known as Cataphiles emerged as a distinct social phenomenon, a term used in urban studies to describe individuals drawn to exploring the unofficial sections of the Paris underground. They're driven not only by the sense of risk, but by the allure of a hidden map, where the city above has an almost parallel reflection below, a silent, complex space bound closely to the material history of Paris. Within this network, Cataphiles became a force that sustained the living nature of the underground after extraction ceased and official routes were established. Their presence does not belong to governance nor to tourism, but exists in an intermediate boundary, where exploration becomes an informal relationship with the city below. Alongside them stand the institutions of management and preservation, viewing the underground as a fragile heritage, where every corridor, every stone block, every supporting structure must be monitored to prevent collapse or damage. At the same time, law enforcement forms a boundary against unauthorized entry, emphasizing that most of this space was never meant for free human movement. Beneath Paris lies a man-made geological structure formed through centuries of limestone extraction, creating a complex spatial system of long corridors, wide chambers, and pillars left in place to support the ceiling. Within this whole, only a very small portion is open to the public, while the majority remains a restricted network extending across nearly 300 kilometers of tunnels. The contrast between what is revealed and what remains hidden creates the sense of a world far larger than what can be directly observed. Culturally, the attraction of this system does not arise solely from prohibition, but from the idea of a parallel map existing alongside the modern city. One Paris above operates through light, traffic, and the rhythm of urban life, while the Paris below exists in absolute stillness, in stone, darkness, and geological memory. These two layers do not fully separate, but overlap, forming the sense of a city far deeper than its surface. It is this parallel that gives the underground its unique pull in modern urban perception, where it is no longer merely a remnant of extraction, but a symbol of concealed existence. The quarry system was never designed for free movement, its structure shaped through generations of uneven excavation, creating corridors that easily disorient areas lacking clear markers and sections at risk of collapse under improper disturbance. Entry beyond permitted zones is therefore not only a legal issue, but a matter of real danger. Over time, human curiosity has at times led to direct impact upon the structure itself, from moving objects to altering the position of heritage elements, revealing a clear paradox between the desire to explore and the potential to damage what is being explored. The more symbolic and mysterious a space becomes, the more it draws actions that exceed the boundaries set to protect it. Restriction does not diminish its attraction, but often intensifies it, as the boundary between legal and illegal becomes part of the experience itself. In this way, the Paris underground becomes not only a physical site, but a social field where curiosity, law, and historical memory continuously interact. If one moves deep enough into those corridors, where sound is absorbed by stone and light is entirely cut off, the first sensation is not danger, but a shift in perception of the city above. The familiar structures of Paris dissolve from spatial awareness. No boulevards, no facades, no rhythm of urban life, only repeating passages whose form scarcely changes. In that state, orientation no longer depends on maps, but on memory of space, where each step may blur the sense of direction and distance. The city above does not vanish physically, but disappears from perception as though the entire surface has been covered by a layer of silent stone. This experience is not dramatic, but one of perceptual imbalance, where stillness becomes the dominant force, replacing every familiar signal of urban life. Within this entire structure, the most striking paradox lies in the fact that the more restricted access becomes, the more powerful a symbol of human curiosity the underground turns into. The catacombs and quarry system are not merely relics, but a place where opposing forces coexist, from extraction history and physical darkness to hidden urban mapping and the urge to cross established boundaries. At the same time, the tension between exploration and preservation creates a continuous pull, where one side seeks to extend experience deeper below, while the other strives to protect the fragile structure from uncontrolled interference. These forces do not cancel one another, but exist together, shaping how this space is understood today. In the modern era, the catacombs are no longer simply a historical relic or a fixed tourist site, but a layered space of meaning, where legal tourism, unofficial exploration, urban memory, and preservation all coexist within a structure that is never entirely stable. It is this layering that prevents the underground from ever being truly still, leaving it always imagined, controlled, and transgressed at once. From there, perception begins to shift further still toward a deeper layer, where the bones themselves are no longer only physical remains or cultural symbols, but may be read as a form of biological record, reflecting the long history of the city, opening another way of understanding memory and time accumulated beneath Paris. In June of 2022, within one of the dampest depths of the Paris catacombs, a section of bone wall gave way without the kind of drama one might expect. Yet in its quiet collapse it opened a narrow fissure between two ways of seeing that had coexisted for centuries, where on one side lay memory, where bones were understood as the remains of human beings, as traces of lives brought to a close, as the silent architecture of remembrance, while on the other side emerged a newer gaze, still forming, in which those same bones began to be seen as a kind of information, something that could be read, examined, and deciphered. From 2023 onward, after initial conservation efforts, research teams began returning to the catacombs not only to reinforce its structure, but to approach the remains as an immense biological archive, where millions of fragments no longer belonged solely to individual memory, but became collective traces of a city stretched across centuries, recording how people once lived, fell ill, ate, adapted, and aged within the same ever-changing urban space. From that moment, bones were no longer merely looked upon in remembrance, but began to be read in the pursuit of knowledge. The focus of research settled within the catacombs beneath Paris's 14th arrondissement, where reinforced ossuary sections, following the collapse, became the starting point for an entirely different approach, one no longer confined to physical preservation, but extending into large-scale biological analysis, with approximately 10,000 bone samples selected from affected zones, sufficient to form a representative cross-section of the vast population of remains beneath the city. In this process, Philippe Charlier, a forensic anthropologist at Paris-Saclay University, played a central role in shaping the catacombs as a retrospective body of data on public health, a form of retrospective public health cohort where each skeleton no longer stood alone, but became a data point within a long continuum reflecting the biological history of Paris. Alongside this, an interdisciplinary group spanning medicine, biology, archaeology, and anthropology worked together to transform a space of remembrance into one that could be read through the lens of modern science. While heritage stewards such as Isabelle Nafo emphasized the balance between extracting knowledge and preserving respect for human remains. From 2023 onward, the most significant shift did not lie in any startling discovery within the catacombs, but in the way people began to look at them, as bone masses once perceived as a silent landscape of memory were now approached as a structured field of data, where each fragment carried information about age, biological sex, traces of disease, and the long-term imprint of urban life. Within this new reading, the question no longer stopped at who had been buried here, but widened to how they had lived, how their bodies responded to nourishment, to illness, to the rhythms of a city carried across generations, and what traces remained upon the bones as a form of biological memory that could not be erased. This transformation did not diminish the humanity of the catacombs, but rather expanded it, where the absence of individual names no longer signified silence, but allowed broader biological patterns to emerge, as though the history of a city were being written not in words, but in the structure of the human body itself. From here, two major lines of research began to take shape, like parallel layers of reading upon the same foundation of data. The first, known as paleodemography, focused on estimating the scale and structure of the population within the immense ossuary beneath Paris, where researchers used durable bones such as femurs to determine the minimum number of individuals present in each section, gradually reconstructing a statistical portrait of those once interred within the system. Early analyses revealed a relatively balanced distribution between male and female individuals, while children appeared less frequently due to the fragile nature of smaller bones, forming an imperfect yet meaningful dataset capable of reflecting a long cross-section of the urban population across centuries. Alongside this act of counting emerged the second line of study, paleopathology, in which scientists searched for traces of disease upon the bones, including syphilis, spinal tuberculosis, rickets, joint degeneration, leprosy, and various forms of bone infection. Each mark no longer an isolated medical detail, but an indicator of living conditions, nutrition, and the urban environment. Further analyses extended into the DNA of pathogens, the presence of heavy metals, parasites, signs of amputation, as well as dental calculus used to reconstruct diet, forming a multi-layered biological dataset in which the catacombs preserved not only people, but also the environments that shaped them, from nourishment to pollution, from illness to biological adaptation. Within this framework, Philippe Charlier described the catacombs as a retrospective public health cohort, a long-spanning dataset of community health, where each individual was no longer viewed as a separate case, but as part of a continuous system reflecting the biological transformations of an entire city. This approach opened an expanded definition of scale, as the catacombs ceased to be merely an archaeological site and became a biological archive perhaps unmatched in both temporal depth and number of individuals, stretching across nearly a millennium, sufficient to record long-term shifts in urban health. Within that space, data no longer resided in documents or modern medical records, but in the structure of bone itself, where every fracture, every deformation, every pathological sign became part of a silent language describing the lived history of Paris. If one day biological analysis advances beyond its current limits, when data no longer stops at traces of disease but can more precisely reconstruct causes of death, epidemic cycles, or nutritional changes across historical periods, the catacombs will no longer remain a passive archive of the past. In such a vision, each skeleton would no longer hold isolated fragments of information, but become part of a continuous biological map of Paris, where disease, environment, and urban history intertwine into a stream of data extending across centuries. What matters is not whether science has reached that point, but the ability to imagine that history may be preserved not only in texts, but within human biology itself, as a form of memory that requires no written word to endure. The greatest shift lies not in analytical technique, but in perception itself, as what was once seen as the silent residue of history now begins to reveal information about disease, age, biological sex, population structure, and living conditions, transforming the catacombs into a place where the past is not only remembered, but read through the language of data. Within this layer of understanding, bones are no longer individual stories, but patterns of a city, reflecting how people lived, how they endured illness, how nutrition and environment left their marks upon the body across time. Thus, the catacombs move from a space of remembrance into a space where history is read through biology. In this new phase, pathological research and heritage preservation no longer stand apart, but exist side by side, where the study of human remains must simultaneously meet the demands of science, ethics, and conservation, reflecting the singular nature of a place that is at once heritage, biological data, and the keeper of human memory. From here, the question no longer ends with how the past unfolded, but extends into how the present chooses to engage with those traces, as they exist at once as scientific information, human remains, and a part of an urban memory that has never truly closed. And the deeper one moves into that field of data, the more a central question emerges, not what the past has said, but how the present listens, and how it chooses to preserve what remains. The catacombs in the present are no longer a space merely to be observed, but something that compels thought to slow, as though its very existence draws perception away from the pace of modern urban life, where memory, technique, and the silence of time coexist within a system still being cared for beneath the city. A large-scale restoration project is underway, set to continue until April 2026, aimed at restoring, maintaining, and protecting a heritage of exceptional fragility. While since November 3rd, 2025, the entire site has been closed to visitors to allow for deep technical interventions, including electrical upgrades, improved air circulation, enhanced fire prevention, and optimized safety within an underground environment that changes slowly, yet without pause. In this context, the catacombs cannot be understood as a finished monument of the past. but as a living heritage system sustained through technology, controlled access, and continuous reinterpretation shaped by the needs of the present. Looking more closely at how this space operates, 3 challenges exist simultaneously as interdependent forces: the preservation of bone within a humid underground environment that shifts gradually with season and geology, the maintenance of respect for human remains as traces that cannot be reduced to display objects, and the responsibility of safeguarding and conveying geological, archaeological, and historical value accumulated across centuries within a single spatial system. It is this layering that moves the catacombs beyond the definition of a site of visitation into a place where material preservation, scientific knowledge, public experience, and ethical limits converge within one structure. In its current operation, the system is maintained by a dedicated management body, responsible for ensuring that the space remains technically viable while not being drawn entirely into the logic of commodified experience. Alongside them stand conservation and research teams, positioned at the boundary between technique and ethics, where every act of structural reinforcement, every environmental adjustment, every interaction with human remains must balance scientific inquiry with respect for the dead, avoiding the reduction of human traces into objects stripped of their inherent humanity. At a broader level, museum and ethics communities place the catacombs within a global discourse alongside laboratories and skeletal archives, where questions of repatriation, rehumanization, limits of display, and institutional responsibility are being reconsidered, reflecting a wider shift in how modern society approaches the material memory of humankind. Within all these layers, the presence of the modern visitor becomes the final point of intersection, where observation is no longer passive, but a moment of awareness in which each individual must locate themselves between memory, knowledge, and the ethical boundaries of looking upon the dead. Within the current restoration framework, the focus does not lie in renewing appearance or crafting a more appealing surface, but in sustaining the existence of a system that is at once physically fragile and burdened with centuries of memory. Upgrades to electrical systems, ventilation, and fire safety are carried out under the pressure of visitor flows that can reach thousands each day, placing constant strain on a space never designed for such modern intensity. Restoration here does not mean aesthetic renewal, but an act of balance, where each technical intervention ensures that the underground structure endures without losing its delicate authenticity. Deeper still, the high humidity beneath Paris creates a condition both stable and in slow motion, where limestone, human bone, and air remain in continuous interaction without a clear endpoint. Under such conditions, preservation becomes an ongoing process that can never be completed, where even the smallest fluctuation in temperature or moisture may affect the integrity of the entire system. The catacombs are therefore not a fixed landscape, but a physically living structure, requiring constant observation, adjustment, and protection against irreversible decay. Yet beyond technique, another question remains: how human beings ought to approach remains that are at once heritage, scientific data, and traces of lives concluded. On the axis of heritage, the focus lies in maintaining the underground structure, protecting bones, stabilizing the environment, and ensuring that visitor pathways do not erode the very foundation of the space. But on the axis of ethics, the question deepens, as display cannot be understood merely as presentation, but becomes an issue of access, of limits to observation, and of the risk of turning human memory into a consumable experience. In recent years, management has shifted toward reducing theatricality, gradually removing the sense of entertainment, guiding the catacombs back toward a state of contemplation and remembrance, where silence itself forms part of its meaning. Within a broader context, the catacombs do not stand alone, but exist within a global debate over how institutions preserve human remains in museums, laboratories, and scientific collections. Issues such as repatriation, decolonization of collections, rehumanization of remains, and ethical responsibility are reshaping how modern societies engage with their material past. In that framework, the catacombs become a clear reflection of a larger question, where the desire to understand history is always accompanied by the obligation to maintain respectful distance from bodies that were once human. As preservation, science, and ethics coexist within the same space, the catacombs emerge as a structure stretched between forces that can never be fully reconciled. One force comes from memory, where each set of remains forms part of urban history. One comes from science, where those remains become data through which the past is understood. One comes from public experience, where entering the space becomes an encounter with death itself. No force is strong enough to erase the others, and none weak enough to be dismissed, forming a state of balance that is always in motion, never still. Within that state, the central question shifts away from the catacombs themselves and toward how modern individuals define their own actions when faced with millions of human traces. Is it learning, observation, experience, or a confrontation with the ethical limits of one's own gaze? The question offers no fixed answer, but lingers as a quiet interval between knowledge and self-awareness, where the observer becomes part of what they are observing. If Paris is understood as a city of light, where art, architecture, and life unfold upon a radiant surface, then the catacombs exist as the memory beneath, where layers of life that have ended do not vanish, but persist in the stillness of matter, data, and time. These two layers do not stand apart, but rest upon one another as two faces of the same urban structure, where the light above finds meaning through the darkness below. In that vision, Paris becomes a layered structure of memory, where every bright boulevard, every open square, every rhythm of modern life stands upon earlier lives, not erased, but transformed into foundation. There is no need to render this as tragedy, for it is precisely its quietness that gives it depth. Every radiant civilization is built upon the continuation of what once was. From this perspective, the catacombs are no longer merely a system of tunnels or a repository of remains, but a form of urban memory structure, where the past is not sealed away, but continues to shape how the present defines itself. The city above moves forward, expands, and changes, while below, memory remains in a prolonged stillness, not for display, but simply to endure. Within that coexistence, life and death are not placed as opposing extremes, but exist within a continuous system, where every step upon the surface unconsciously touches deeper layers of history. And when this awareness is held long enough, the catacombs cease to be the end of a story and become instead a quiet reminder that every city, every body, every civilization carries within it multiple layers of existence, some of which never fully disappear. And perhaps it is in that state that the catacombs continue their silent role, not only preserving the traces of the dead, but preserving as well the slow learning through which the living come to look upon death with greater patience, greater depth, and a deeper sense of humanity.